Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, focusing on international law, international relations, and Brazil. He's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to the show.
Always good to talk to you, Will.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, always a pleasure and honor to have you on our program. Now, before we tap into your latest article, I want to read something quite fascinating to you regarding the current political state in America. Now, the senator from the state of Hawaii, Brian Schatz, and he recently posted something rather alarming, especially regarding the Democratic Party in general in the States. And this is what he posted, and I quote, "I am not into blacklisting anyone from future work in the area of expertise, but I do think it's fair to want a whole new crop of foreign policy staffers in the next Democratic administration. It's not like the same 120 people are the only people who know anything," end quote. Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, we look at the foreign policy today under Trump. For example, the war between U.S. and Iran, the war in Ukraine, and also the relationship between U.S. and China at this moment. And in addition to all of that, Trump is still very much interested in meddling regarding the country of Cuba. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, how much can we agree with the senator that for someone or for the next Democratic administration, we really need fresh ideas, or we really need to get rid of the same old traditional conventional mindset in order to understand the future or understand the world in a better way? Your thoughts?
I think, Will, that, and I've said this many times, the Cold War has left many widows. Many people who cannot get over the fact that the Cold War is over, that it has been over. And many of them dedicated their lives to studying about Russia, about the Soviet Union, and somehow they want to repeat the same formula that they learned in the past into, China and the relationship between China and the United States. And there isn't anything that could be, as far as possible from reality, because China is no way at all similar to the Soviet Union. The world is different. The economies are more integrated. China doesn't want to play the role that the Soviet Union did. China doesn't want to do many of the things that the Soviet Union did. And it's a completely different country. But the mind frame of these people is the same. And they want to reproduce. And they have these two models. Either China is going to behave like Japan in the economic side and behave like the Soviet Union. So those are the two models. And we have to adapt and make sure that, China fits into these two models. So there's no strategic thinking or long-term thinking. And that's the challenge that you observe, is that the practice and the policies that have been implemented have been following this manuscript, this guideline and this guidebook. And that is why Americans need to think anew in relation to China, in relation to their position in the world. Because what we see is that, for instance, many of the policies that Trump implemented in his first term, the Democrats just kept it, right? There was no change in many of the policies, particularly regarding China, because the thing that happens is that any president from the United States wants to sound tough against China. And if they change the policy, they're going to be perceived as weak. Remember how surprised everybody was when Donald Trump, for instance, decided to travel to Pyongyang, or to travel to, not to Pyongyang, but travel to Korea, and then he crossed the DMZ, right? And it was everybody was complaining about, because the establishment in the U.S. politics, in the European politics, they have been trained a certain way. And they're not willing, and that's the impression I have, to change the mind frame and the way they work. They think that they have this formula, and this formula is applicable all the time. And the truth of the matter is that it's not. So you have to think different. You have to think, you have to believe things in a different way, and you have to approach things in a different way. And one of them, I think the most important item in the agenda, is eventually to recognize, too, that perhaps the moment of the United States being the hegemon and the superpower of the world is no longer there. So that requires a level of humility also to understand that. So that's why I understand, and that's why I say they need to rethink the way they do things.
Dr. Marcus, let's bring another person into our conversation again. This person, it's rather famous, and especially within this whole Democratic Party, and some believe that she is a rising star, and possibly that even though she has not confirmed anything, but she has not ruled out any options for running in 2028, who is the current Congresswoman, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, recently, at a Munich security conference, this is how she described the world that we live in today, and I want to read a brief description to you, Dr. Marcus, and I quote, "It's possible that we were in a pre-ruled based order. We have an opportunity to explore what a world will look like if we upheld democracy, human rights, trade that actually centers working class people instead of accruing overwhelmingly the benefits of trade to the wealthiest," end quote. Dr. Marcus, as we look at the political polarization in America today, and of course you mentioned that it looks like the international community tend to focus on the wrong thing or tend to misinterpret the intention of some of the countries. But going back to the statement from Congresswoman AOC, how much do we believe that today, when we look at the world order, we are way past this what we called rule-based order? So in other words, it looks like this international disruption or this international, what we say, the chaos can actually create much greater opportunities. How much would you agree with that?
Well, I will disagree on a few things. Just because the United States may not be leading the new formation or this reorganization of the world order, that doesn't mean that the world order is in shambles or everything is chaotic. Because when the Americans say that, they want to reaffirm and they want to affirm, and not only the Americans, Europeans too, that they are the indispensable players for the world order. And what we are saying, and what BRICS and what the other countries are saying is that, okay, you are very relevant in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s. For the last 70 years, you greatly benefited from this world order. But it wasn't so liberal, and it wasn't so much of an order. You just look at the number of sanctions that have been applied by the Europeans all over the world, together with the Americans. You look into all the sanctions that we have created, all the problems, all the wars that we have had. So we like to emphasize that, this world order is great. Of course, it worked very well in the case of China because the Chinese learned how to play with the rules. But it was never easy for China in the process. Right? Think about all the traps that have been made along the process to get China entrapped into the certain situations. And it's not only with China, it's with Brazil, it's with Latin America. We have created this Washington consensus, for instance, which was sold to everybody around the world. That was the best thing there was. Now the countries regret many of the policies that they implemented as a result of the Washington consensus. Even the IMF and the World Bank implemented policies that didn't really work. I always give this example. Argentina had an enormous and very effective train system, railroad system? Well, the first agreement that the IMF does with Argentina is to remove, that from public accounts and now get rid of it, basically. So that's one thing that we keep saying, and we keep pounding and say, oh, the world is disorganized, the world is not. No, the world will live independently of the Western countries or the United States leading the process. We always found ways to reorganize ourselves. We always find ways to live with each other. And we have to remember, wars happen here and there. It happens a lot in Europe because European countries have an enormous scarcity of resources. And that's why they keep fighting against each other. But if we look, and that's always my concern, because we always try to play and say that the world order is chaotic. No, it's not chaotic. And it will necessarily make the adjustments that are necessary, that are needed. But to say that, just because the West is not leading the process and everything is chaotic and there is a sense of fear, this doesn't really correspond to the reality of the world. And I think that discourse has this purpose of somehow deteriorating the quality and diminishing the quality of the new players. And that's the concern I have when we talk about this issue, right? It's not that it was a perfect world order, and it's not true. We all know that, right? But we're fantasizing and say, oh, it was so good. It wasn't. And that's why we need to change, and that's why we need to adapt, and that's why we need to move into a different direction.
Dr. Marcus, let's talk about the publication or the article that came out and you contributed so much, which is entitled Hormuz and the Invisible Fractures, the Price of a Distant War, Views from the New South. Of course, today, Dr. Marcus, we continue to pay closer attention to the war between US and Iran. And recently, just under the Trump administration, there seemed to be a universal belief that US has successfully, air quote, ended the war with Iran, and despite what the reality is. And of course, we know that today the war has not ended at all, because the two sides has not reached agreement. And again, especially we look at this political power, this military engagement from both sides. But meanwhile, in the article, Dr. Marcus, you pointed out specifically, and look at this comparison and contrast when we look at this, what we called a renewed partnership, or, even there's a line that says the state through the lens of COVID-19 and the center presents a new contribution examining the impact of conflict between the US, Iran, and Israel on different regions. So Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, how do we understand the word partnership at this moment? Again, a moment ago, you mentioned that we perhaps don't need global order stability. But what about the partnership? It seems like the countries today cannot trust each other. There has to be a tit for tat, or there has to be a mutual benefit in order to enhance the relationship. So again, going back to the question, where is the partnership, and how do we define that when we look at the war between US and Iran, or look at the war between Israel and Lebanon? How do we understand that?
Well, it's not that I don't say that we need to have an order, right? I say we're playing with the rules, right? We're still doing trade, we're still doing commerce. Now, you see that the ones that built the order are the ones that are creating problems for the order, right? The United Nations is a great idea. Why is it not functioning? Why is it not working? Well, because the major founders or the most relevant players initially from the West really have devalued the United Nations. So why isn't the World Trade Organization working so well? Because we have created, the West has, so what we found out is that the West somehow is curtailing the organizations and the system that it established. Right? But despite all this, we do see that countries want to play by certain rules. And it can be on a bilateral agreement, but they do not want the thing to go into chaos. For instance, China is a great supporter of the World Trade Organization and the World Trade Rules and all this. China benefits from it, but the whole world benefits from it. So you do not see China opposing it. Same thing with Brazil. Same thing with South Africa. Same thing, Australia. You see some countries that want things to keep moving on, right? So that's an important issue to consider when we're looking into this. Now, the problem is that, again, and I agree, if we do not change the mind frame, we are going to create other types of problems. Let me give you an example. And that shows a little of the double standard that you have right now. And that's what has, this is basically what has led the global South to be a little annoyed with the things that are happening. I'll give an example. For the longest time, everybody wanted to reduce emissions. Everybody said that we need to reduce emissions, particularly CO2, because there was climate change. Now, two things happened. China became the largest producer of solar panels in the world. China has become the number one country to promote technology that reduces CO2 emissions. And China has created electric vehicles like no one else. Well, you look into these three things and you realize a few other aspects. Number one, the United States, for instance, started saying that, particularly Trump, started saying that climate change is a Chinese hoax, something that the Chinese created to take advantage, right? And it's kind of funny because this is the same Trump that wants to annex, Greenland, based on the fact that there is climate change and affecting the Arctic. So you see the incompatibility of the political discourse. Now you see the Europeans always standing and saying, oh, we are pro-environment and all this. They do not allow the importation of Chinese EVs, which really have an enormous impact on CO2 emissions. So I always say, and one thing to my students, it's the liberal order until page number 2. After page number 3, things become, my rules, my goals, my country first. This is what happens after the second page. And so we have to see things and interpret things as they are. Now, what is the interesting aspect? Well, some of these things have been validated, for instance, by the Global South. They like this stability because they need this stability. For instance, in the meeting that took place between President Trump and President Xi, the key word, the most relevant word in all the discussions was stability. And that's precisely where the West is failing in the process. So my opinion is, when I look into BRICS, when I look into other situations, we will see lots of attempts to destroy this stability that these countries want. But it is clear that they want stability with the Western players or without them. It would be great if they join, but we understand that, if they're going to keep creating problems, then we're not going to go very far.
Dr. Marcus, I have 2 more questions before letting you go. Let's go back to the article. This is something that you contributed and mentioned regarding the role of Beijing. And this is what you wrote, and I quote, Beijing adopts a position of qualified neutrality, condemning the strikes while maintaining pragmatic relations with all regional actors and avoiding direct military alignment, end quote. Dr. Marcus, you're the expert. What was say a couple years ago, or even we trace it back to 10 years ago, we could understand, or we would try to understand the word neutrality, because we know that China has never been interested in meddling any international affairs, and let alone any domestic affairs for any other countries. But right now, since we're looking at the complication of the world order, we're looking at the complication of the geopolitics, how much can Beijing afford to maintain, or even to borrow the word that you use called adopt a position of qualified neutrality? So in other words, what does that mean? Qualified neutrality. And number two, how can Beijing maintain that position? Because it seems like the whole world, if we put a sense that we all can understand, it's everybody, it's screaming for China to step out the comfort zone, to help, to support. But China cannot be a bench player anymore. There has to be a political or perhaps even economic reaction to any unexpectancies. So what does that mean? What is the definition of qualified neutrality? And number two, how does Beijing maintain that position today? Your thoughts?
Well, I think that China wants to deliver a different message to the world. Because if China is going to repeat the same model of the West, right? Why are we going to seek to improve the relationship with China? If it's more of the same, right? So I think that the Chinese government understands that if they play the same rules, if they follow the same guide, the same playbook, people are going to prefer the order as it is, which makes sense, right? So China has to provide a way of doing things that are different. Now, what are the two major elements that China offers to the world that's very clear? One, non-interference. China doesn't want to interfere. China doesn't even believe in alliances. You only have one military alliance.
That's right.
But you believe in partnerships, right? So you want to be a partner because alliances reflect a world where everybody needs to be together, always fighting against each other. So China says, no, we don't have alliances, we have partnerships. So first thing that China offers to the world is, okay, this is our development model. It has worked out for us, right? Is it going to work for everybody? We don't know. But we do know that China is not exporting its political system, but it's exporting its story of development. And I think that's an important thing because everybody in the world wants to learn that story to see how they can repeat. And second, I think is a very interesting difference in the message. The West thinks it's individual, right? America first, Europe first, the West is first. China comes with a message of saying, a shared future for humanity. It's a whole different concept. And of course, the Chinese realize that this takes time for people to understand because we're leading into a different path. Of course, from time to time, we got used in our mind frames to certain ways and certain reactions. I've been asked many times, why doesn't China put an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean? I said, because that's not the way China does things. China believes that, if you reach a certain level of economic development, many of the problems that we have will go away. And additionally, the less you interfere, the more you really return the power to the people, locals, to make the decisions that are going to be better for them. Because, and that's an important thing, Will, if interventions that the West did along the way, countries would be in a much better situation, and they're not. There was a little study that I saw today and yesterday, the number of wars has increased a lot. Why? Because the system hasn't worked and hasn't performed. So I think that, it's like a new gospel that China is spreading, telling, develop, make money, get rich, partnerships, and let's think about the world as a shared community, not something only individual, only individually.
Dr. Marcus, I want to ask you the last question. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Again, experts believe that 2026, the Strait of Hormuz crisis has already generated a global energy shock with mixed consequences for South American economies. And of course, not only for the countries in South America, and also we'll look at the countries in the global South. So my last question to you, Dr. Marcus, how much can the countries, especially in the global South, can bear this global energy shock? I mean, again, we'll go back to the question, go back to the statement I said before. Trump seemed to believe that U.S. has successfully ended the war with Iran, or perhaps even he loved to use the word won, right? So U.S. won the war over Iran. But I know in reality, that's a different story. We need a lot of factors to check that. But meanwhile, there's still so many countries in the global South are bearing this energy shock or this global energy crisis. So how long can we still believe that those countries are still able to put together until there has to be official ending or official termination of the war between U.S. and Iran? Your final thoughts.
Will, I may think that I'm the best looking man in the world. Am I? Not really, right? I may think many things about myself, which are not going to be the reality. Same thing about the war. This is a war that on day one, it was said that, they had won the war, right? So we may believe many things, and the human mind allows you to believe whatever you want to believe.
That's right.
Is it real? That takes a little while for it to become reality. The truth is that I think the global South should send a bill to the United States and to Israel for creating this war that was completely uncalled for, right? This is like the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq had, or thinking that Iran was going to be an easy thing like Venezuela was. But I think the challenge really is that this was a war of choice, an asymmetric war of choice, where the United States and Israel thought that they could win easily. And that was their huge mistake. And a mistake that has cost the world billions, if not trillions of dollars, that unfortunately we cannot charge. But that has deteriorated the situation all over the world, including China. And it was an interesting thing that Trump initially said, well, we're not going to be affected by this, so we don't care. We don't buy oil from, we're not dependent on the Strait of Hormuz to get our oil. You see, the level of selfishness that we had in these decisions. Little did he realize, little did he know that the United States would be highly affected because it is inserted into the world economy. And the worst thing that happened, I think, is that if President Trump wanted Iran not to have nuclear weapons, which the Iranians affirmed that they were not going to have, Trump, together with Netanyahu, gave Iran a much more dangerous and problematic weapon. Iran never controlled the Strait of Hormuz. It was not an issue. And they could create an impact that was much greater than any atomic bomb that they could have used to explode. The international community would go against them. There would be sanctions. They would be, in a very bad situation. Now they found a much better weapon than the nuclear weapon, which is the Strait of Hormuz. And that was a gift by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to the Iranians. And one that your military power cannot control. So and that's what I say. The arrogance that we saw plus a mind frame, plus the idea of us being first, never took into consideration that sometimes you may think that you're going to win a war, but you have to ensure that the other part is willing to lose. And what we saw here is that Iran was not willing to lose, has not been willing to lose, and is doing everything it can not to lose. And at the end of the day, they realize that thanks to this war, they're much stronger than they were before. And the alliances that the United States had in the region have all the Arab countries that the purpose of the American presence is not to protect these countries, but to protect Israel. So that's the challenge, and that's the problem we see in this whole situation.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, I agree with you 100%. Like you mentioned before, it's not about putting which country first. It's about sharing a mutual humanity, or sharing the benefits for the greater future. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University. Well, Dr. Marcus, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.